As Provost of the University of Chicago, it is my privilege to introduce Richard Rosengarten, who will deliver today's convocation address. An expert on narrative theory and modern religious thought, Professor Rosengarten has written and lectured on the theological dimensions of works by such authors as Swift, Voltaire, and Ellison. He has also emerged as a sought-after national voice on questions of the academic study of religion. Professor Rosengarten's critically acclaimed book, Narrating Providence, Divine Design, and the Incursions of Evil in the Novels of Henry Fielding, gave literary historians and religious scholars a deeper understanding of the author and of the ways that his work reflected shifting ideas about God's role in the universe. He is currently completing study of religious poetics entitled Styles of Catholicism, which will examine the theological dimensions in the work of Flannery O'Connor, Frida Kahlo, and Simone Weil. Professor Rosengarten's career at the University of Chicago has been marked by exemplary leadership and vision and a feared hookshot. After receiving his master's degree and PhD from the university, he returned in 1991 as Dean of Students of the Divinity School. From 2000 to 2010, Professor Rosengarten served as the Dean of the Divinity School, broadening the scope of the curriculum to include the study of Islam, expanding options for interdisciplinary scholarship, and working to make the Divinity School more affordable for its graduate students. The Div School's place as the premier institution for religious studies in the United States owes much to Professor Rosengarten's foresight and dedication. The title of his talk today is In Retrospect. Rick.
Degree candidates and your loved ones and friends present here today or in spirit, colleagues on the faculty, deans, officers, trustee, Provost Rosenbaum, and President Zimmer. It is an honor, a pleasure, and I am mindful of privilege to address this convocation in celebration of, as the university well phrases the matter, individual achievement as well as institutional progress and continuity. So, I first salute all you graduates. I commend your splendid accomplishments. And in that spirit, I invite us to think together about what it might mean to celebrate your work in the context of the university's motto, Crescat scientia, vita excolatur, belief in knowledge enhances life. I am a scholar of religion and literature, and what I shall talk to you about today is, in a word, stories. I spend most of my scholarly time, scandal that it is, researching and teaching about modern stories, especially novels, satires, and autobiographies. In what follows, I call them narratives because it helps to connote what I most love about them, that they are at once as simple and as complex as any human being or any institution, and the word narrative serves, I hope, to convey both that familiarity and that complexity. I'll talk briefly today about two of the very best narratives I know and love, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, in which, to paraphrase my colleague Jonathan Z. Smith, a certain magic dwells. I'll try to get at that magic by talking about the two cardinal features of any narrative. One is that they are always retrospective, hence my title. The other is that they always involve something that I'll call cognitive dissonance, and how these fit together and what it means for our experience of stories is my whole simple, but I think you'll see also complex, point today. So first, narratives are always written retrospectively. The teller is relating something that happened, or, given the role imagination plays, adopts the conceit that something happened. The hero of Robinson Crusoe tells the story of his time on a desert island, told after he's returned home to merry old England, as though it turns out he doesn't stay very long. Jonathan Swift's Lemuel Gulliver relates his travels under the same conceit. The retrospective viewpoint they adopt implies that what happened wasn't fully or well understood as or when it happened. It also suggests that the teller who had the experience now understands it better. Told retrospectively, the reader will now hear the truth about it. It's the particular magic of these stories that readers naturally recognize and understand this dynamic of retrospection. It's no accident that Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver are known not only to adults, but to many children. So in reading these narratives, we effectively see the teller doing history, with the crucial twist that it's fictional, which means that the reader doesn't care whether the past they are making sense of references an actual event. This is worth pausing over. There were ample historical antecedents for the kinds of sea adventures that Defoe and Gulliver describe. Contemporary readers knew this, and part of the appeal is this verisimilitude to known events. The point, what makes it a story, not history, was not whether what Crusoe narrated was exactly what happened to Alexander Selkirk, perhaps Crusoe's most famous and arguably the most analogized historical antecedent. It was that seeming oxymoron, fictional truth. What this means has been of interest from the time of Plato and Aristotle. A useful recent formulation is the phrasing of the literary critic Frank Kermode, who wrote about the sense of the ending, what we aim to describe when, having finished a narrative, or increasingly these days, having seen the movie or the miniseries, we describe as tragic, or comic, or satiric. This sense we have of a narrative's ending references its cumulative effect on us, a question not of whether what we have heard actually happened, but of how we are supposed to judge it, how it makes us feel, and whether those feelings are true. This is often complex, the more so because what the narrative purports does not restrict the liberty of the reader. In Robinson Crusoe, it's clear Defoe wants the reader's sense of the ending to be theological. Crusoe comes to understand that God put him through such a trial as a sign of favor, and that the terror and the loneliness he initially felt when stranded on the island, his subsequent resignation to his condition, spawned an industry and productivity to make the best of it, that in turn made him a more self-conscious creature of God. He became, Defoe wanted us to think, a model child of God, and paradoxically, but not incidentally, a model citizen, thanks precisely to his isolation. Defoe's idea was not, however, the sense that some of Defoe's later readers made of his ending. Karl Marx is a great example. Marx loved Crusoe's story, but thought it was an allegory of the promises and the pitfalls of the focus on the acquisition of goods, or capital. So we can see that in the case of Robinson Crusoe, the sense of the ending of a narrative, how we understand its retrospective view of events, once poorly understood, now brought to clarity, involves a complex negotiation between an author and a reader, a teller and a hearer. Swift grasped this at least as clearly as Defoe, and was determined to exert a more forceful and controlling effect on the reader's reactions. After visiting the tiny Lilliputians and the immense Brobdingnagians, followed by a third journey to a motley of strange island societies, the winds and waves of some unnamed ocean deposit Gulliver in the land of the Houyhnhnms, a polity of horses. Gulliver comes to regard the society as superior because it is utterly rational and ordered, and he speedily becomes a happy and devoted servant of the horses in charge. Despite this devotion, Gulliver eventually is banished from the society. This occurs not because of anything he does, but because he has become the unwitting but unmistakable object of the carnal affection of the yahoos, the ape-like creatures whom the horses subdue through a form of slavery. Fearing that Gulliver's arousing presence might galvanize insurrection or even revolution, the Houyhnhnms expatriate their most loyal citizen. The reader last encounters Gulliver at home in England, deeply disenchanted to be resident in what he regards as an inferior society. His last words report that he keeps 2 horses in a barn behind his home, where he spends as much time as he can for the sake of superior conversation. Serious scholarly ink has been spilled over the question of whether Gulliver is at this point out of his senses, insane, and indeed over whether Swift, the author behind Gulliver, somehow himself went insane in concluding with this image. Whether that is so seems to me to make the mistake of treating this as history rather than fiction. Instead, we should think about what it can mean that our very gullible hero prefers talking with animals to talking with humans. However different in the degree of control they choose to exert, we can see that both Crusoe and Gulliver narrate events through a double lens, as they experienced them at the time, and what is different as they now understand and reorganize them in the telling. I want to suggest that this double telling is innately human, and that to think in retrospect is to think in this double way, to recall with as much accuracy as we can muster the details of our experience, and at the same time to arrange or to order those details to show their meaning, a sense that comes from knowing the ending, from being able to tell how it all turned out. The force of this is best conveyed by something much underestimated but crucial. Here's my aforementioned second idea. Implicit in this double way of thinking is that is retrospection, is what I shall term cognitive dissonance, by which I simply mean the discovery forced upon your awareness that something you took to be a settled truth is in fact demonstrably false. By way of illustration, I offer two examples, one personal and one public. I well remember the occasion when I learned from a noted demographer that we humans lie more often and more egregiously about the money we do or don't earn than about the sex we do or don't have. Some of you will be unsurprised to learn that this epiphany occurred when I was younger. A second example from the public domain would be that of the political pollster and commentator Karl Rove, who had a decided experience of cognitive dissonance, unhappily for Mr. Rove in a very public venue, on the evening of November 6th. Now, my point in invoking cognitive dissonance is that the most interesting narratives are the ones that are motivated by this sort of revisionary experience. This allows a refinement of our formulation about narrative. To think in retrospect is to rehearse an experience of dissonance, and in doing so, to rethink the world anew. This is what the narrative properly understood does for us, and it is essential to our humanity. We in this assembly might regard it as an especially salutary gloss on the university's motto, where the scientia is translated as retrospective narrative. Just as cognitive dissonance is the experience of finding oneself in error, narrative is its counterpart, the practiced human art of retrospection. Narrative relates what was poorly or partially understood from a viewpoint that can acknowledge it to have been such, from a better understanding that it simultaneously offers. The immediate and local application is probably clear, but it may merit brief rehearsal. Each of you graduates has thought, is thinking, or at some point will be thinking, maybe all three, in just this retrospective way about your time here. Some of you may regard it, Crusoe-like, as a kind of forging of a better person. Some of you may decide, like Gulliver and most of the faculty, that you want to spend your life talking to horses. Whatever your particular chains of circumstance, you will find yourself narrating retrospectively the life you have experienced towards some superior understanding. A few of you may even write about it. So true, so good, so beautiful, but so what? Perhaps you find yourself restive. You may be thinking, well and good, but what are we to do with this superior understanding? What you've described so far, Rosengarten, is decidedly contemplative rather than active. There's that other part of the university's motto, vita excolatur, and I worry that what you're describing is all Crescat with your own particular scientia riding happily along in a sidecar. Very convenient for you, but why relevant to me? Well, this is a perfectly reasonable observation, worthy of the critical skills you've cultivated at this university, and I'll conclude by addressing it. So to the degree that the worry privileges prognostication over retrospection, it seems to me suspect. Put too crassly, I worry about a too speedy recourse to cash value. Our priests of prediction afford ample supporting testimony to my view. I know of no reputable economist, and at Chicago we have only reputable economists, who will tell you that we have reliable models for macroeconomic activity. Social scientists caution us that most citations and discussions of data are either misguided or overreach, or both. Your recent predecessor in these pews, Nate Silver, has both a proven track record for disciplined prognostication and a recent book, The Signal and the Noise, which discusses how we might discriminate the relevant from the irrelevant in the plethora of data literally at our fingertips. To the degree that our worry about the insularity of retrospection reflects an impatience for results, I don't myself find large grounds for sympathy with the objection. Indeed, I suspect that retrospection may well be our most useful mental exercise to discipline ourselves to find the true signal in the midst of all that noise. Talking to horses, it turns out, has its uses. So a blow for scientia, and indeed for my particular scientia, that turns out to be not the sidecar, but the very engine of staying on course as we move forward. Lurking close behind this, however, loitering with righteous intent, is a worry with which I not only sympathize, but resonate to the core of my being, the charge of solipsism. What's to keep our retrospection from being merely self-referential? Thinking in retrospect is, I've suggested, something that we do naturally, even habitually, to a degree that familiarity allows us to underestimate its sophistication. It's a way to cultivate and refine our personhood. We make ourselves better by doing it. But such goods can also be overemphasized to the point of seeming sufficient in and of themselves. How do we avoid this? Well, a true scientia of narrative is the study not of ourselves, but of someone else. Much as we understand and empathize, very few of us wish, at least as adults, to see ourselves course-cruising Crusoes or as gullible Gullivers. Reading their cases is an encounter first in the retrospective narration of someone else. We meet the teller in her, his otherness, albeit at the level of one of the most human of activities. Note, too, the terms of this engagement. Thinking in retrospect via narrative involves a confessional aspect. The teller testifies to her cognitive dissonance about an aspect of the past. At the same time, there is a tandem accompanying profession of truth. We discover in the retrospective telling of the tale the direct juxtaposition, indeed usually the intertwining, of the virtues of humility with truth-telling. So reading retrospective narrative and thinking about our own lives in retrospect suggests that the virtue of contemplation also involves the cultivation of the virtues. So retrospective narrative actually leads us outside ourselves, and we can see that a true scientia of narrative allows us to, as it were, drink the excolatur of getting closer to real difference in the context of a common human activity. That, friends, is, in my humble opinion, the most apposite definition of all the human sciences, the attempt to engage the most enduring questions of our common humanity with the most principled and disciplined respect for difference. If this is true, there is indeed no excolatur without scientia. You have then ordered your lives admirably in pursuing your scientia and now embarking on the path to excolatur. A final crucial point. The university's motto engages in a parallelism that would make the psalmist, who is above all a very great poet in the richest sense of the term, proud indeed. If there is no excolatur without scientia, there can also be no vita without some sort of Crescat. No enhancement without knowledge, so no life without belief. Some of you will know that this university's founders were affiliated with the American Baptist religious tradition. Themselves Christians living at the turn of the 20th century, they can and sometimes are, even on this campus that they founded, easily misconstrued. They did not impose their beliefs upon the university, even as they did insist steadfastly upon the rightful place of religion in its scholarly life. You processed past an exemplary expression of it when you entered the chapel today. They spoke of religion, never of Christianity, at the university. My own campus home, the Divinity School, was from the outset a place where the study of the world's religions and the idea that such study could include principled engagement with the various forms of Crescat was encouraged and cherished and remains so to this day. So my point is to say that no vita without Crescat is simply to acknowledge that no truly human life lives itself without continual reference to some deeply held value. To be clear, I don't know of any more impressively articulated set of such values than the religions of the world, but I also don't think the religions exhaust those possibilities, historically or otherwise. The real point of retrospective narrative is change, but it is change that is thoughtful and prescient and engages the past as well as the future. The challenge to each of you today can be articulated most concretely via a final short example that is most relevant to the majority of you who are graduating from our Booth School of Business. Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, is most often referenced in this regard for his The Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which he published in 1776, and which articulates such staples as the division of labor. But Smith only wrote this after he had penned what he regarded as its foundational document, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in 1759. In retrospect, we see Smith more clearly if we recognize the trajectory of his thought. No theory of wealth without a theory of moral sentiment. Those of you in what are in this winter quarter smaller cohorts in other parts of the university should go forth and think about your version of this formulation, then act on that. If you accept the challenge, I promise you will engage in retrospective narrative on your way, and readily aver that in doing so you will indeed be pursuing belief and knowledge to the enhancement of life. Congratulations.